So, how should the photographs used in the lineup be presented to the eyewitness? One choice is whether we present the photographs simultaneously, that is, they are laid out side by side in front of the eyewitness so that they could all be viewed at once. However, one problem with this approach is that it may encourage relative rather than absolute judgments. That is, eyewitnesses approach the task as being to determine who in the lineup looks relatively most like the criminal, rather than an absolute decision as to whether the criminal is actually present or not. That is, the structure of simultaneous lineups may foster the same sort of bias to pick someone as biased instructions do. What can we do about this? Well, one alternative is to use a strategy suggested by Roderick Lindsay of Queen's University and Gary Wells of the University of Alberta, known as the sequential lineup. This is where each member of a lineup is viewed in turn. The eyewitness is asked, "Is this the person you saw?" and they have to answer yes or no. In the ideal version of this, eyewitnesses wouldn't know in advance how many photos will be in the lineup, and the procedure will stop on the first positive ID. The idea is that with a sequential approach, we minimize that implicit imperative for eyewitnesses to compare the lineup members with one another, that problematic relative judgment. Instead, they are effectively being told to compare each individual against their memory of the real criminal. That is, they're making an absolute judgment, and it's the absolute judgment that we want. That's the principle, but is there any evidence to suggest that using the sequential rather than the simultaneous presentation helps witnesses correctly identify the suspect more often? Nancy Steble of Augsburg College and her colleagues did a meta-analysis of 30 research studies looking at this very question and concluded that using the sequential lineup procedure did indeed result in fewer false identifications than simultaneous presentations. There was some evidence that sequential lineups resulted in fewer correct hits, as well as fewer false positives, following the same reasoning with biased instructions. However, in this case, Nancy Steble reported that when she took more realistic conditions into account, this effect largely disappeared. That is, sequential lineups didn't result in fewer correct hits when real-world factors were considered. So, the current consensus appears to be that sequential lineups are better practice than simultaneous lineups. One other technique that's been investigated by psychologists to address the issue of response bias in eyewitnesses is to first deliberately show them a blank lineup where none of the members of the lineup are the suspect. The idea is that if your eyewitness does pick someone from the lineup that you know for sure has no criminals in, then this may indicate that their judgment on the real lineup should be called into question. You've essentially screened them for an inappropriate response bias. Gary Wells investigated whether this strategy worked or not, and he found that whether or not eyewitnesses made a false ID on the blank lineup predicted whether they would make a false ID on the real lineup. That is, we have evidence that this technique works. In the next presentation, we'll turn our attention to the members of the lineup who aren't the suspect, the people we know are innocent, and how we ought to go about choosing them.